The handcuffs click shut around Dr. Amara Sterling's wrists as Richard Pemberton, the bank manager, smirks from behind the marble counter. Officer Kyle Brennan roughly guides her toward the exit, while other customers stare in shock. The $2.3 million deposit slip lies crumpled on the floor. Another fraud attempt stopped, Pemberton announces to his staff, loud enough for everyone to hear. These people think they can just walk in here with fake checks. Suddenly, the bank's glass doors burst open. A woman in a sharp navy suit strides in, flanked by two federal agents. She surveys the scene, Amara in handcuffs, the scattered paperwork. Pemberton's triumphant expression. "Release her immediately," the woman commands, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Pemberton scoffs. "Ma'am, this is police business. This woman was attempting to deposit a fraudulent—" "That woman," the federal agent interrupts, pulling out her credentials, "is Dr. Amara Sterling, Senior Defense Contracting Officer. And you just called the police on the person responsible for your bank's $8.7 billion government contract." The color drains from Pemberton's face as the gravity of his mistake becomes clear. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Dr. Amara Sterling adjusted her navy blazer as she walked through the glass doors of Meridian Trust Bank on a crisp Tuesday morning in Brookfield Heights. At 34, she had spent the last decade building Sterling Defense Solutions from a one-woman consulting firm into one of the most respected minority-owned defense contractors in the country. Her company specialized in advanced satellite defense systems, and her MIT doctorate in aerospace engineering had opened doors that few people who looked like her had ever walked through. The morning had started like any other at her home office. Marcus, her husband of 8 years and a former Army engineer, had kissed her goodbye as he headed to his job at the local Veterans Center. "Don't let them intimidate you at the bank today," he'd said with a knowing smile. "You've earned every dollar of that contract." The contract. Project Aegis represented the culmination of 3 years of proposals, presentations, and rigorous Pentagon vetting. Sterling Defense Solutions had been selected over giants like Lockheed Martin and Boeing to develop next-generation satellite defense technology for the Department of Defense. The $8.7 billion contract was the largest ever awarded to a minority-owned business in the defense sector. Amara carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate predominantly white, male-dominated spaces since her undergraduate days at MIT. She dressed impeccably, spoke with precise articulation, and always came over-prepared to every meeting. These weren't personal preferences, they were survival strategies developed through years of having her competence questioned before she even opened her mouth. The initial contract payment of $2.3 million had arrived via electronic transfer from the Pentagon that morning. It wasn't an unusual amount for her business dealings, but it was significant enough that she preferred to handle the deposit personally rather than through her usual business banking channels. Meridian Trust had been courting her company for months, promising premium service and dedicated relationship management for high-net-worth clients. As she approached the marble-lined lobby, Amara noticed the subtle ways the space communicated exclusivity. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, while oil paintings of the bank's founding fathers, all white men from the early 1900s, adorned the walls. The clientele reflected the neighborhood's demographics, mostly affluent white professionals conducting their morning banking business. She had chosen to dress professionally, but not ostentatiously. A tailored navy suit, modest jewelry, and her company briefcase containing all the necessary documentation. Everything about her appearance communicated success and legitimacy. Yet she knew from experience that assumptions would still be made. At the information desk, she approached Jennifer Walsh, a blonde woman in her 20s who barely looked up from her computer screen. "I need to make a business deposit," Amara said politely, placing her ID and business documentation on the counter. Jennifer glanced at the paperwork dismissively. Dollar amount? 2.3 million. The typing stopped. Jennifer's eyes narrowed as she studied Amara more carefully, as if seeing her for the first time. I'll need to get a manager for an amount like that, she said, her tone shifting from indifferent to suspicious. Richard Pemberton emerged from his glass office, a man in his late 40s with the soft appearance of someone who had never questioned his position in the world. His smile was practiced, but didn't reach his eyes as he approached. Ms. Sterling, is it? Jennifer tells me you're looking to make a rather large deposit. Dr. Sterling, Amara corrected gently. Yes, it's a business deposit from a federal contract payment. Pemberton's eyebrows raised slightly at the correction, but his demeanor remained skeptical. A federal contract? What kind of business are you in exactly? Defense contracting. Satellite technology systems for the Pentagon. Amara handed him her business card and a copy of the contract summary, watching as he studied both with obvious doubt. And this check, it's legitimate? The question hung in the air, loaded with implications that both of them understood perfectly. Amara maintained her composure, though she felt the familiar knot forming in her stomach. It's an electronic transfer, actually. All the documentation is here, including verification codes from the Pentagon's financial systems. She had been through this dance before. The skeptical questions, the extra verification requests, the assumption that someone who looked like her couldn't possibly have legitimate business at this level. But she had never experienced it quite this brazenly, especially not when she was the customer the bank had been actively pursuing. What Amara didn't know was that Richard Pemberton was facing his own pressures. The bank had been struggling to meet its quarterly targets, and his job security depended on maintaining the trust and confidence of Brookfield Heights' wealthy clientele. In his mind, allowing questionable transactions could jeopardize the bank's reputation and his own position. As she waited for him to review her documentation, Amara checked her phone. 3 missed calls from the Pentagon's contracting office and 2 from her assistant. Project Aegis was moving fast, and delays in accessing the initial funding could cascade into serious problems with the project timeline. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, her routine banking transaction would spiral into a confrontation that would expose the ugly underbelly of institutional bias and ultimately threaten the very contract she had worked so hard to secure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Richard Pemberton studied Amara's documentation with theatrical skepticism, holding each paper at arm's length as if it might contaminate him. After 5 full minutes of examination, he set the papers down and fixed her with a stern look. "Dr. Sterling," he began, emphasizing her title with barely concealed sarcasm, "I'm going to need additional verification for a transaction of this magnitude. The documentation you've provided, well, it's unusual for our typical clientele." Amara felt her jaw tighten, but kept her voice measured. "What specifically needs verification?" "I have the Pentagon's electronic transfer confirmation, the contract authorization number, and my business license." "What more do you require?" Pemberton gestured vaguely at the papers. "Anyone can print official-looking documents these days. We've had issues with sophisticated fraud attempts lately." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Particularly in this neighborhood, we have to be extra cautious about unusual activity." The coded language wasn't lost on Amara. She had heard variations of it countless times throughout her career. "Mr. Pemberton, I can provide you with direct contact information for the Pentagon's contracting office. They can verify this transaction immediately." "That won't be necessary just yet," Pemberton replied, walking back to his office. "Jennifer, please have Mrs. Sterling wait in the customer service area while we run our standard verification procedures." "It's Dr. Sterling," Amara corrected again, noting how he had deliberately demoted her title. "And how long will this verification take?" "I have a conference call with the Defense Department in 30 minutes. Jennifer looked between Amara and Pemberton uncertainly. Sir, the documentation looks comprehensive. Maybe we could— Jennifer, Pemberton cut her off sharply, please follow our established protocols. We can't be too careful with transactions like this. Amara watched the exchange with growing concern. In her briefcase was a time-sensitive contract addendum that needed to be signed and returned to the Pentagon by end of business. The deposit was crucial for establishing the dedicated project accounts that would allow work to begin immediately. Mr. Pemberton, she said, standing to follow him, I understand your need for caution, but this is a routine business transaction. I've provided all standard documentation, and I'm willing to provide additional verification if you can specify exactly what you need. Pemberton stopped and turned, his patience visibly wearing thin. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and return to the waiting area. Your aggressive tone is making other customers uncomfortable. Amara looked around the lobby. The handful of other customers were conducting their business normally, paying no attention to their conversation. Her voice had been completely professional throughout the exchange. I haven't raised my voice, she said calmly. I'm simply trying to understand your verification process so I can comply with your requirements. Are you calling me a liar? Pemberton's voice rose, causing heads to turn. I clearly heard you becoming aggressive and demanding special treatment. The accusation hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Amara realized she was being maneuvered into an impossible position. Any response could be characterized as confrontational, while silence would be taken as admission of guilt. I'm not asking for special treatment, she said quietly. I'm asking for the same professional service you would provide to any business customer making a legitimate deposit. Sarah Mitchell, the bank's security guard, approached cautiously. A black woman in her 50s, she had worked for Meridian Trust for over a decade and had witnessed countless interactions like this one. Her eyes met Amara's briefly, conveying sympathy and warning in equal measure. Is there a problem here, Mr. Pemberton? Sarah asked diplomatically. Yes, there is, Pemberton replied, his voice carrying across the lobby. This customer is refusing to follow our verification procedures and becoming increasingly hostile when asked to comply with standard banking protocols. Amara felt the weight of every gaze in the lobby settling on her. She recognized the trap being constructed around her, a narrative of aggression and non-compliance that would justify whatever action Pemberton chose to take. I haven't refused anything, she said, addressing Sarah directly. I've asked for clarification about what additional verification is needed, and I've offered to provide contact information for direct confirmation from the Pentagon. Pemberton's face flushed red. The Pentagon, really? Do you expect us to believe that someone like you has legitimate business with the Pentagon? The words escaped before he could stop them, revealing the bias that had been driving his actions from the beginning. Someone like you? The phrase echoed through the suddenly silent lobby. Jennifer gasped audibly. Sarah's expression hardened. Even the other customers had stopped their transactions to stare at the unfolding scene. Excuse me? Amara's voice was ice-cold. Someone like me. What exactly do you mean by that? Pemberton realized his mistake, but doubled down rather than apologize. I mean someone without an established banking relationship with us, making claims about large government contracts. It's highly irregular. I see, Amara said, pulling out her phone. In that case, let me call the Pentagon's contracting office directly so they can speak to you about the legitimacy of my business. Put that phone away, Pemberton snapped. I won't have you disrupting our branch with unnecessary drama. If you can't follow our procedures, perhaps you should consider banking elsewhere. The ultimatum was clear, but Amara wasn't backing down. She had faced discrimination before, but never so blatantly, never with so much at stake. The contract deadline was approaching, and without access to the initial funding, her entire company's future could be jeopardized. Mr. Pemberton, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect in high-stakes situations. I'm going to give you one more opportunity to process this legitimate business transaction professionally. If you continue to refuse, I'll be forced to escalate this matter to your corporate headquarters and to the federal agencies involved in this contract." It was a reasonable statement, a professional warning about the consequences of his discriminatory treatment. But in Pemberton's mind, already committed to his course of action, it sounded like a threat from someone who had already proven herself to be troublesome. He reached for the phone on Jennifer's desk. "I'm calling the police. We have a customer who's refusing to comply with our procedures and making threats against the bank." The lobby fell completely silent. Amara stared at him in disbelief, realizing that her routine banking transaction had just escalated into something far more serious than she had ever imagined possible. Within minutes, Officer Kyle Brennan arrived at Meridian Trust Bank, his hand resting casually on his service weapon as he surveyed the scene. A 20-year veteran of the force, Brennan had responded to countless calls from businesses in Brookfield Heights, and he knew the unspoken expectations of the community he served. "What seems to be the problem here?" Brennan asked, directing his question exclusively to Pemberton, while barely acknowledging Amara's presence. Pemberton stepped forward with renewed confidence, bolstered by the arrival of law enforcement. "Officer, this woman came in here attempting to deposit what appears to be a fraudulent check for over $2 million. When we asked her to follow our standard verification procedures, she became hostile and threatening." Amara opened her mouth to respond, but Brennan held up a hand without looking at her. "Sir, please continue. She claims to have some kind of government contract," Pemberton continued, his tone dripping with incredulity. "When I questioned the legitimacy of her documentation, she started making threats about calling federal agencies and corporate headquarters. Frankly, officer, I'm concerned about the sophisticated nature of this fraud attempt." Brennan nodded sympathetically, finally turning to Amara with the weary expression of someone who had seen it all before. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some identification and an explanation of what you're doing here." "Certainly," Amara replied, maintaining her composure despite the surreal nature of the situation. She reached slowly for her purse, conscious that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. "I'm Dr. Amara Sterling, and I'm here to make a legitimate business deposit from a Pentagon contract." Brennan examined her driver's license with exaggerated scrutiny, as if it might reveal hidden secrets.
"Pentagon contract, huh?
"What kind of work do you do, Miss Sterling?" "Dr. Sterling," she corrected patiently. "I'm a defense contractor specializing in satellite technology systems. My company, Sterling Defense Solutions, was awarded a contract for Project Aegis." The officer and bank manager exchanged meaningful glances. Brennan handed her ID back dismissively. "Right, and this alleged contract, how much are we talking about?" "The total contract value is $8.7 billion over 5 years. Today's deposit represents the initial payment of $2.3 million, Pemberton snorted audibly. "Officer, does this sound believable to you? A woman running some kind of satellite business out of Brookfield Heights, claiming to have billion-dollar government contracts." Sarah Mitchell, who had been watching the exchange with growing discomfort, stepped forward. "Mr. Pemberton, maybe we should verify her claims before—" "Sarah, please return to your post," Pemberton cut her off sharply. "This doesn't concern security." But Sarah had worked in banking long enough to recognize genuine documentation when she saw it. More importantly, she had experienced enough discrimination in her own career to recognize the patterns playing out before her eyes. Officer Brennan turned back to Amara, his skepticism evident. "Ma'am, these are some pretty serious claims you're making. The Pentagon doesn't just hand out billion-dollar contracts to small businesses. What's your background? Where did you go to school?" The questions felt like an interrogation, each one implying that someone like her couldn't possibly possess the qualifications for such work. Amara felt the familiar exhaustion that came with constantly having to prove her legitimacy in spaces where her presence was questioned. I have a doctorate in aerospace engineering from MIT, she replied evenly. I spent 5 years at Lockheed Martin before starting my own company. All of this information is readily available if you'd like to verify it. MIT, huh? Brennan's tone suggested he found this claim as dubious as the contract. That's convenient. And I suppose you just happen to have all this fancy documentation with you today. I always carry comprehensive documentation for business transactions, Amara said, frustrated by the implication that being prepared was somehow suspicious. I can provide you with contact information for the Pentagon's contracting office, my company's registration with the Small Business Administration, and references from previous clients. Pemberton shook his head theatrically. Officer, this is exactly what I was telling you. She has an answer for everything, but it's all too convenient. Real business people don't carry around this much paperwork unless they're planning something. The logic was circular and absurd, but Amara could see it gaining traction. Her preparedness was being used as evidence of guilt, while any lack of documentation would have been equally damning. Jennifer Walsh, who had been quietly observing the interaction, finally spoke up. Mr. Pemberton, I've processed large business deposits before. Her documentation actually looks more thorough than usual. Pemberton's face flushed with anger. Jennifer, I'll thank you not to second-guess my assessment of this situation. We have protocols for a reason. Officer Brennan consulted his notepad, writing down details with deliberate slowness. Dr. Sterling, the bank manager here says you were threatening to call federal agencies. That sounds like an attempt to intimidate bank personnel in the commission of a potential fraud. I offered to have the Pentagon verify the legitimacy of the transaction, Amara clarified, her voice rising slightly in frustration. That's not a threat. It's exactly what any reasonable person would do to resolve questions about documentation. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to calm down, Brennan said, his hand moving to his belt. Getting agitated isn't helping your case here. Amara realized she was trapped in an impossible situation. Any attempt to defend herself was being characterized as aggression, while silence would be interpreted as admission of guilt. The systematic nature of the discrimination was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one biased bank manager, but about an entire network of assumptions and prejudices that operated seamlessly together. Other customers in the lobby watched the scene unfold with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. Some recorded with their phones, while others whispered among themselves. Amara could hear fragments of their conversations. She does seem suspicious. Why would someone like that have that kind of money? Probably stolen. The court of public opinion was forming its verdict based not on evidence, but on appearance and assumption. Look, Pemberton said, addressing Officer Brennan as if Amara weren't standing right there. I've been in banking for 15 years, and I know fraud when I see it. The sophisticated documentation, the elaborate story about government contracts, the aggressive response when questioned, it's all textbook. I understand your concerns, Brennan replied, pulling out his handcuffs. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to turn around and place your hands behind your back. On what charges? Amara asked, her professional composure finally cracking. Attempted bank fraud and disturbing the peace, Brennan replied matter-of-factly. You have the right to remain silent. As the Miranda rights echoed through the marble lobby, Amara felt the weight of systemic injustice crushing down on her. This wasn't just about a bad bank manager or an overzealous police officer. It was about a society that couldn't conceive of a black woman legitimately wielding the kind of power and success she had earned. But what none of them knew was that at that very moment, phones were ringing in Pentagon offices, and very powerful people were beginning to ask questions about why Dr. Amara Sterling hadn't checked in for her scheduled conference call. General Patricia Hayes stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Pentagon office overlooking the Potomac River as she reviewed the morning's intelligence briefings. At 52, she was the highest-ranking black woman in the Department of Defense, having risen through the ranks by combining strategic brilliance with unwavering integrity. As Director of Defense Innovation and Acquisition, she oversaw the most critical technology contracts in the military. Her assistant, Colonel James Morrison, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 15 years of flawless service. "General, we have a problem with Project Aegis." Patricia turned from the window, her expression sharpening. Project Aegis was her baby, a revolutionary satellite defense system that could protect American assets from hypersonic missiles and cyber warfare. After 3 years of development and vetting, they had finally found the perfect contractor. What kind of problem, Morrison? Dr. Sterling missed her 10 a.m. conference call. No notification, no response to messages. Her office says she went to the bank this morning for a routine deposit and hasn't returned. Patricia frowned. In the 18 months she had worked with Amara Sterling, the woman had never missed a scheduled call, much less failed to communicate. Sterling Defense Solutions had impressed everyone at the Pentagon with their professionalism, innovation, and reliability. Have you tried her cell? Goes straight to voicemail. Her husband says she left for Meridian Trust Bank in Brookfield Heights around 9 a.m. to deposit the initial contract payment. Patricia's frown deepened. She had handpicked Dr. Sterling for Project Aegis after an exhaustive search. The woman was brilliant, MIT doctorate, 5 years at Lockheed Martin, patents in satellite technology that had revolutionized the field. More importantly, she understood the strategic implications of their work in ways that larger contractors often missed. Morrison, something doesn't feel right about this. Sterling doesn't just disappear. Should I contact the bank, General? Patricia considered this. Her instincts, honed through decades of military service and high-stakes negotiations, were telling her that this was more than a simple scheduling mix-up. She had seen too many talented minorities face unexpected obstacles in the defense industry to dismiss her concerns. Pull up everything we have on Meridian Trust Bank. Financial records, government contracts, personnel files. I want to know who we're dealing with. While Morrison worked at his tablet, Patricia reflected on her own journey through the defense establishment. She had faced countless situations where her competence was questioned, where routine procedures became extraordinary hurdles, where her presence in high-level meetings was treated as an anomaly to be explained rather than authority to be respected. Interesting, Morrison said, looking up from his research. Meridian Trust has been aggressively pursuing government contracting business. They've submitted proposals to handle military payroll systems and veteran benefit distributions. Worth about $2.8 billion over the next 5 years? Patricia's expression turned calculating. So they have a significant financial interest in maintaining relationships with Defense Department contractors. More than that, General. Their regional president, Thomas Chen, has been lobbying for a meeting with you for months. They want to be designated as the preferred banking partner for defense contractors in the Mid-Atlantic region. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that Patricia didn't like. She had learned long ago that when successful minorities encountered unexpected problems with financial institutions, it was rarely a coincidence. Morrison, I want you to call Meridian Trust's Brookfield Heights branch. Ask to speak with Dr. Sterling. Don't identify yourself as Pentagon personnel. Just say you're returning her call. 5 minutes later, Morrison returned with a grim expression. General, you're not going to like this. The branch manager, Richard Pemberton, claims there's no Dr. Sterling at the bank. Says he's never heard of her. Patricia felt the familiar cold anger that she had learned to channel into strategic action. Call the Brookfield Heights Police Department. Ask if they've had any incidents at Meridian Trust this morning. The answer came back quickly. Dr. Amara Sterling had been arrested for attempted bank fraud and was currently being processed at the county jail. Patricia stood silent for a moment, processing the implications. A Pentagon contractor with a valid $2.3 million government payment had been arrested while trying to deposit it at the bank that was actively seeking Defense Department business. General? Morrison asked cautiously. Patricia turned to face him, and he recognized the expression that had earned her respect in rooms full of generals who initially doubted her capabilities. It was the look of someone who had faced discrimination herself and would not tolerate it being inflicted on others. "Morrison, clear my calendar for the next 4 hours. Contact the Attorney General's office. I want to speak with someone from Civil Rights Division immediately. Then get me the commanding officer at Brookfield Heights Police Station. Should I also contact Meridian Trust's corporate headquarters? Not yet. I want to see how this plays out first. Sometimes people reveal more about themselves when they think they're dealing with someone powerless." Patricia walked to her desk and picked up a red phone that connected directly to the Secretary of Defense. This wasn't just about one contractor or one incident. This was about the integrity of the Pentagon's supplier network and the message being sent to minority-owned businesses throughout the defense industry. "Jim," she said when the secretary answered, "we have a situation that requires immediate attention. One of our most critical contractors has been arrested while conducting routine business related to Project Aegis." As she briefed the secretary, Patricia was already formulating a response that would address not just the immediate injustice, but the systemic issues that had allowed it to occur. She had spent her career fighting for a more inclusive defense industry, and this incident would become a watershed moment in that struggle. Meanwhile, in a holding cell 60 miles away, Dr. Amara Sterling sat on a metal bench, her business suit wrinkled and her phone confiscated, unaware that the most powerful woman in defense procurement was mobilizing the full weight of the federal government on her behalf. What Richard Pemberton and Officer Brennan didn't understand was that they hadn't just arrested a random customer, they had taken into custody someone whose work was essential to national security and whose mistreatment would soon reach the highest levels of government. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, and they would prove to be far more powerful than the prejudice that had set this chain of events in motion. Within 2 hours of learning about Dr. Sterling's arrest, General Patricia Hayes had transformed her Pentagon office into a command center. 3 secure phone lines buzzed with activity as she methodically gathered intelligence and built her response strategy. Unlike the emotional reactions that Richard Pemberton and Officer Brennan expected from those they targeted, Patricia's approach was calculated, comprehensive, and devastating in its precision. "Colonel Morrison," she called to her assistant, who was coordinating between multiple federal agencies, "what's the status on the financial audit?" Morrison consulted his tablet, reading from Secure Communications. "Treasury Department has flagged irregularities in Meridian Trust's reporting. They've been systematically underreporting deposits from minority-owned businesses while inflating their government contract acquisition metrics. The discrepancies go back 18 months. Patricia nodded grimly. It was exactly what she had suspected. And the FBI's Financial Crimes Division? They're reviewing the bank's compliance records. Apparently, Meridian Trust has had 17 complaints filed against them for discriminatory practices in the past 2 years. All were dismissed during internal bank investigations, but the patterns are undeniable when analyzed collectively. The general walked to her secure computer terminal and pulled up classified files on defense contractor security protocols. What Richard Pemberton didn't understand was that Dr. Sterling wasn't just any contractor. She was handling technology so sensitive that her arrest would trigger automatic security reviews throughout the Pentagon. Morrison, who else has access to Project Aegis specifications? Only 4 other contractors, General, all significantly larger firms with extensive security clearances. Patricia's strategic mind was already several moves ahead. Contact each of them. I want to know if they've experienced any unusual banking difficulties in the past 6 months. Focus on institutions that have been pursuing government contracts. While Morrison made calls, Patricia reviewed the intelligence file on Meridian Trust Bank. The institution had been aggressively expanding into government contracting business, submitting proposals for military payroll services, veteran benefit management, and defense contractor banking relationships. Their regional president had been lobbying for exclusive partnerships that would route billions in government payments through their systems. General Hayes? Morrison looked up from his phone with a troubled expression. I just spoke with executives at Raytheon and General Dynamics. Both reported unusual delays and additional scrutiny at Meridian Trust branches when conducting large transactions. The bank requested extensive additional documentation beyond standard requirements, only for minority executives or all personnel. That's the interesting part, General. When I asked them to specify which employees experienced these delays, they all mentioned their diversity and inclusion program participants, minority engineers, women in leadership positions, and contractors from historically black colleges. Patricia felt the cold fury that had driven her through decades of fighting systemic discrimination. This wasn't random prejudice. It was a coordinated effort to create barriers for minority participation in the defense industry. Her secure phone rang with a call from the Attorney General's office. General Hayes, this is Deputy Attorney General Michael Rodriguez. I understand you have concerns about civil rights violations affecting national security contractors. That's correct. Mr. Rodriguez, we have a situation where discriminatory banking practices are directly interfering with critical defense programs. Dr. Sterling's arrest appears to be part of a larger pattern targeting minority-owned businesses in the defense sector. What do you need from justice? Patricia's response was swift and decisive. I need a federal civil rights investigation into Meridian Trust Bank, focusing on their discriminatory lending and service practices. I also need Dr. Sterling released immediately. Her continued detention is compromising Project Aegis timelines. Consider it done. We'll have federal agents at the Brookfield Heights jail within the hour. As Patricia coordinated the federal response, she also activated her network within the defense industry. She called CEOs at major contractors, board members of defense technology associations, and key congressional staffers who oversaw military appropriations. Each conversation planted seeds that would grow into significant pressure on Meridian Trust. General, Morrison interrupted, I have Thomas Chen, Meridian Trust's regional president, on line 3. He's requesting an emergency meeting. Patricia smiled coldly. Put him through. General Hayes, Chen's voice was carefully modulated, professional but with an undertone of concern. I understand. There may have been some misunderstanding at one of our branches involving a Defense Department contractor. Mr. Chen, one of our most critical contractors was arrested while attempting to deposit a legitimate Pentagon payment. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was discriminatory treatment that has compromised national security operations. Chen's pause was telling. General, I assure you that Meridian Trust has the utmost respect for all our customers. If there was an error in judgment, we're prepared to make immediate corrections. The correction needed goes far beyond one incident. Mr. Chen, a preliminary investigation suggests a pattern of discriminatory practices specifically targeting minority-owned defense contractors. That pattern directly conflicts with federal law and Defense Department policy. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss. Mr. Chen, Patricia interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed by close of business today. I need Dr. Sterling released, all charges dropped, and a formal apology issued. I also need a comprehensive review of your bank's practices regarding minority-owned businesses. Failure to cooperate fully will result in Meridian Trust being barred from all government contracting opportunities. The threat was delivered calmly, but its implications were staggering. Being excluded from government contracts would cost the bank billions in potential revenue. Meanwhile, Patricia's staff had been documenting everything. Phone records, email communications, witness statements from other defense contractors, and statistical analysis of banking patterns. The evidence was building into an unassailable case of systematic discrimination. Morrison, contact the Pentagon's Public Affairs Office. I want a statement prepared about our commitment to protecting minority-owned defense contractors from discriminatory practices. Make sure it mentions the specific incident without naming individuals. Should we also reach out to defense industry publications? Absolutely. I want every defense contractor in the country to know that the Pentagon takes discrimination against our suppliers seriously. The message needs to be clear. Attacking our contractors is attacking national security itself. As the afternoon progressed, Patricia received updates from multiple fronts. The FBI had confirmed that Meridian Trust had violated several federal banking regulations. The Treasury Department had flagged suspicious reporting patterns. The Justice Department had filed preliminary civil rights complaints. Most importantly, federal agents were en route to secure Dr. Sterling's immediate release. But Patricia knew that individual justice, while essential, wasn't enough. This incident had exposed a vulnerability in the defense procurement system that needed to be addressed systematically. She began drafting new policies that would protect minority contractors from discriminatory treatment and create accountability mechanisms for financial institutions serving the defense industry. General, Morrison announced, Dr. Sterling has been released. Federal agents escorted her out of the county jail 20 minutes ago. Patricia allowed herself a moment of satisfaction before returning to her strategic planning. The immediate crisis was resolved, but the larger battle for equality in defense contracting was just beginning. What Richard Pemberton and Officer Brennan had intended as a routine exercise of discriminatory power had instead triggered a federal response that would transform the entire relationship between government contractors and financial institutions. The hunter had become the hunted, and they had no idea what was coming next. Thomas Chen's hands trembled slightly as he disconnected from his call with General Hayes. As regional president of Meridian Trust Bank, he had built his career on managing crises, but nothing had prepared him for the prospect of losing billions in government contracts due to one branch manager's discriminatory actions. Within 30 minutes, his executive conference room filled with the bank's crisis management team, legal counsel Margaret Foster, public relations director David Kim, and head of compliance Robert Walsh. The atmosphere was tense as Chen briefed them on the morning's catastrophic events. How bad is this? Margaret Foster asked, her legal training immediately focusing on liability exposure. Potentially catastrophic, Chen replied, loosening his tie. We're talking about a Pentagon contractor with an $8.7 billion contract. The FBI Director of Defense Innovation just threatened to bar us from all government business unless we resolve this immediately. David Kim pulled up social media feeds on his laptop. It's already going viral. Someone filmed the arrest at the Brookfield Heights branch. Banking while black is trending, and major news outlets are picking up the story. Chen felt his stomach drop. In the age of social media, discrimination cases could destroy institutional reputations within hours. What's our exposure on the government contract side? Robert Walsh consulted his files. We have $2.8 billion in pending proposals with various federal agencies. If they blacklist us, we lose everything. Plus, current government accounts worth another $1.2 billion could be terminated for cause. The financial implications were staggering. Meridian Trust's stock price would plummet, shareholders would demand answers, and Chen's own career would be over. We need to contain this immediately, Chen declared. Margaret, draft a settlement offer. Whatever it takes to keep this quiet, Margaret Foster shook her head grimly. Tom, this isn't just a civil matter anymore. The Justice Department has opened a federal investigation. Dr. Sterling isn't some individual customer we can pay off. She's connected to national security operations. David Kim looked up from his laptop with alarm. There's more. Richard Pemberton has been posting on social media for years. Inflammatory comments about diversity in banking, complaints about unqualified minority loan applicants. It's all screenshot and being shared. Chen's face went pale. "Get me Pemberton on the phone, now." When Richard Pemberton answered, his voice was defensive but still arrogant. "Mr. Chen, I followed all established protocols. That woman was clearly attempting fraud. Richard, federal agents just escorted that woman out of county jail. She's a legitimate Pentagon contractor, and you've created a public relations nightmare that could destroy this bank." There was silence on the line before Pemberton spoke again, his confidence wavering. "The documentation looks suspicious. How was I supposed to know she was legitimate? By following proper verification procedures instead of making assumptions based on prejudice," Chen snapped. "Your social media posts are being circulated right now, Richard. Comments about urban customers and maintaining neighborhood standards. Did you think no one would notice?" Pemberton's breathing became audible over the phone. "Those posts were taken out of context. I was just discussing banking security measures." Margaret Foster motioned for the phone. "Mr. Pemberton, this is legal counsel. We need you to avoid any public statements and report to corporate headquarters immediately. Do not speak to media, do not post on social media, and do not discuss this incident with anyone." After disconnecting, Chen turned to his team. "Options? We could offer Dr. Sterling a significant settlement with a non-disclosure agreement," Margaret suggested. 7 figures, public apology and disciplinary action against Pemberton. David Kim shook his head. "That won't work with federal investigators involved. Plus, the Pentagon official made it clear this isn't about money, it's about systematic change." "What about Officer Brennan?" Robert Walsh asked. "Can we distance ourselves from the police response?" "Difficult," Margaret replied. "Pemberton called the police. We're liable for the entire chain of events." Chen's phone buzzed with a text from the bank's CEO. "Emergency board meeting in 2 hours. Explain yourself." Meanwhile, Officer Kyle Brennan sat in Captain Rodriguez's office, sweating through his uniform as internal affairs investigators questioned his handling of the arrest. "Officer Brennan," Detective Lisa Park began, "did you verify Dr. Sterling's claims before arresting her?" "I responded to a bank fraud call. The manager said she was attempting to pass fraudulent documents, but did you verify the documents yourself? Did you contact the Pentagon or run background checks?" Brennan shifted uncomfortably. The bank manager seemed credible. He said he had experience with these types of fraud attempts. Detective Park slid a folder across the table. "These are Dr. Sterling's credentials. MIT doctorate, 5 years at Lockheed Martin, current Pentagon security clearance, registered business owner. All verifiable with simple database searches." Brennan's face flushed as he realized the magnitude of his error. The bank manager was insistent that, "Officer Brennan, did Dr. Sterling resist arrest in any way?" "No, but she was argumentative about the bank's procedures." "Argumentative how?" "Specifically." Brennan struggled to recall details that would justify his actions. "She kept insisting she was legitimate, making claims about Pentagon contracts. It seemed like typical fraudster behavior." Captain Rodriguez leaned forward. "Kyle, we've got federal investigators asking questions about this arrest. The woman you detained has top-secret security clearance and was conducting legitimate government business. This is a disaster." Back at Meridian Trust headquarters, Chen received a call that made his blood run cold. Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Senate Banking Committee, was requesting a formal hearing about discriminatory practices in financial services. "Margaret," he said after hanging up, "it's spreading beyond the Pentagon. Congress is getting involved. We need to get ahead of this," she replied. "Full public apology, immediate policy changes, and Pemberton's termination." David Kim looked up from his phone. Too late. Pemberton just gave an interview to a local news station. He's claiming he was following bank policy and that Dr. Sterling was suspicious and uncooperative. The room fell silent. Pemberton had just made the crisis exponentially worse by going public with his discriminatory views. "That's it," Chen said, his voice hollow. "Contact our insurance company about liability coverage." Prepare termination paperwork for Pemberton and get our best crisis management firm on retainer. Robert Walsh raised his hand tentatively. Tom, there's something else. I've been reviewing complaint files. We have 17 similar incidents in the past 2 years, all involving minority customers, all dismissed during internal reviews. Chen felt the walls closing in around him. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was evidence of systematic discrimination that would expose the bank to massive federal penalties and civil rights violations. How many people knew about these patterns? The compliance committee, senior management, and the board. Chen realized that his attempt to contain the situation had failed before it began. The evidence of systematic discrimination was too extensive, too well documented, and now too public to cover. Dr. Sterling wasn't just one customer seeking individual justice. She had become the catalyst for exposing decades of discriminatory practices that reached the highest levels of the bank's operations. The cover-up was unraveling faster than they could construct it, and federal investigators were just getting started. The federal courthouse in downtown Washington buzzed with unprecedented activity as media crews set up cameras for what had become the most closely watched civil rights hearing in the financial sector in decades. Dr. Amara Sterling sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a team of Justice Department attorneys and civil rights lawyers, facing the mahogany-paneled chamber where her case would be presented to the world. Across the aisle, Meridian Trust's legal army occupied 3 full tables, led by their crisis management firm and the most expensive white-collar defense attorneys money could buy. Thomas Chen sat in the front row behind his lawyers, his confident demeanor from days earlier replaced by the hollow expression of someone watching his empire crumble. Judge Sarah Washington, a Reagan appointee with an impeccable reputation for fairness, called the hearing to order. This emergency session addresses the Department of Justice's motion for a temporary restraining order against Meridian Trust Bank, pending investigation into systematic civil rights violations. The court will hear evidence regarding discriminatory banking practices that allegedly interfere with national security contracting. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Chen, no relation to the bank, President, stood to present the government's case. Your Honor, this isn't about one unfortunate incident. The evidence will show a coordinated pattern of discrimination designed to exclude minority-owned businesses from full participation in the defense industry. He activated a large screen displaying statistical analysis that made the courtroom gasp audibly. Over the past 18 months, Meridian Trust processed deposits from 847 defense contractors. White-owned businesses experienced an average processing time of 12 minutes. Minority-owned businesses averaged 3.2 hours, with 34% requiring additional verification beyond standard procedures. Dr. Sterling was called as the first witness. As she approached the stand, cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the composed dignity of someone who had transformed personal injustice into institutional change. Dr. Sterling, Attorney Chen began, please tell the court about your qualifications and the nature of your work. Amara's voice was clear and professional as she detailed her MIT doctorate, her patents in satellite technology, and her role in Project Aegis. I was selected by the Pentagon to develop next-generation defense systems critical to national security. The contract represents the largest award ever made to a minority-owned firm in the aerospace sector. And what happened when you attempted to deposit the initial contract payment? As Amara recounted the events at Meridian Trust, the courtroom remained silent. Her detailed testimony painted a picture of systematic humiliation disguised as banking protocol. When I offered to have Pentagon officials verify the legitimacy of the transaction, Mr. Pemberton's response was to call the police. Meridian Trust's lead attorney, Jonathan Hayes, approached for cross-examination with visible reluctance. Any aggressive questioning of Dr. Sterling would only reinforce the narrative of institutional bias. Dr. Sterling, isn't it possible that Mr. Pemberton was simply following established security procedures? Mr. Hayes, I've conducted similar transactions at 17 other financial institutions. None required police intervention for routine deposits with proper documentation. Hayes shifted tactics. The amount was unusually large. Surely additional verification was reasonable. Sir, the documentation I provided included Pentagon authorization codes, Treasury Department routing information, and my company's federal contractor identification. What additional verification would justify calling law enforcement? Hayes had no answer that wouldn't further incriminate his client. The prosecution then called Colonel Morrison, General Hayes's assistant, who testified about the broader pattern of discrimination affecting Pentagon contractors. We identified 23 defense contractors who experienced unusual banking difficulties at Meridian Trust branches. All were minority-owned businesses. All occurred when processing government payments. He presented internal bank emails that the FBI had obtained through federal warrant. The courtroom stirred as messages appeared on screen showing branch managers discussing heightened scrutiny for certain demographics and maintaining neighborhood standards. Thomas Chen's face paled as his own emails appeared, including one to regional managers stating, "We need to ensure our government contracting relationships reflect the quality and reliability our shareholders expect." When Chen was called to testify, his expensive legal preparation crumbled under prosecutorial pressure. "Mr. Chen, what did you mean by quality and reliability our shareholders expect in this email to branch managers?" "I was referring to standard banking protocols and due diligence procedures. Standard protocols that resulted in Dr. Sterling's arrest for depositing a legitimate Pentagon payment? That was an unfortunate misunderstanding by one employee." Attorney Chen displayed another email. "This message from you to Mr. Pemberton 3 weeks before Dr. Sterling's arrest reads, 'Richard, your branch continues to excel at maintaining our standards. Keep up the excellent work screening transactions.' What standards were you referring to?" Chen's lawyer objected, but the damage was clear. The bank's leadership had been directly involved in encouraging the discriminatory practices. Richard Pemberton took the stand looking defeated. His union representative had abandoned him. The bank had denied providing discriminatory guidance, and federal prosecutors had offered reduced charges in exchange for truthful testimony. "Mr. Pemberton, did you receive training on how to identify suspicious transactions?" "Yes, but not just formal training. We had regular meetings where management explained what to look for." "What specifically were you told to look for?" Pemberton's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Transactions that didn't fit the neighborhood demographics. Large deposits from people who seemed out of place for the area." "And how did you determine who was out of place?" The question hung in the air for a long moment before Pemberton answered. "Based on their appearance and whether they looked like they belonged in an affluent area." The admission sent murmurs through the packed courtroom. Pemberton had just confessed to racial profiling under oath. Officer Brennan's testimony was equally damaging. When asked why he hadn't verified Dr. Sterling's claims before making the arrest, his answer revealed the depth of institutional bias. The bank manager seemed credible, and the suspect's story seemed unlikely. A black woman claiming to have billion-dollar Pentagon contracts. It just didn't seem realistic. Judge Washington's expression hardened. "Officer Brennan, are you testifying that you based your law enforcement decisions on racial assumptions about who could legitimately hold government contracts?" Brennan realized too late what he had admitted. That's not what I meant." "That's exactly what you meant, officer. And that assumption led you to arrest a Pentagon contractor conducting legitimate business." As the day's testimony concluded, the evidence of systematic discrimination was overwhelming. Bank emails, statistical patterns, witness testimony, and recorded conversations had built an unassailable case. Judge Washington announced she would rule on the restraining order the following morning. But her questions during testimony had made her position clear. Outside the courthouse, Dr. Sterling faced a wall of reporters. "Dr. Sterling, what do you want to see happen to Meridian Trust?" Her response was measured but powerful. "I want accountability that ensures no other minority business owner experiences what I did. This case isn't about revenge. It's about equal access to the financial services that make the American dream possible." Thomas Chen, escorted by security through a back entrance, declined to comment as his lawyers hustled him toward waiting cars. That evening, General Hayes watched the news coverage from her Pentagon office with satisfaction. The public confrontation had exposed the full scope of the discrimination and created pressure for systematic reform. The evidence was in, the witnesses had testified, and the country had seen exactly how institutional bias operated in practice. Tomorrow would bring consequences that reached far beyond one bank's discriminatory practices. Judge Washington's ruling the next morning sent shockwaves through the financial industry. The temporary restraining order against Meridian Trust was just the beginning of a comprehensive federal response that would reshape how banks interacted with minority-owned businesses across the entire defense sector. Within 48 hours of the hearing, the Department of Justice announced the largest civil rights investigation into banking practices since the 2008 financial crisis. Attorney General Lisa Martinez held a press conference that was broadcast live across major networks. The evidence presented in federal court reveals a coordinated effort to exclude minority-owned businesses from full participation in the American economy, Martinez declared. This investigation will examine not just Meridian Trust, but systematic barriers throughout the financial services industry that deny equal access to banking services based on race and ethnicity. The ripple effects were immediate and far-reaching. The Federal Reserve launched parallel investigations into 12 other financial institutions that served significant numbers of government contractors. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency suspended Meridian Trust's application for expanded government banking privileges pending resolution of the civil rights violations most devastating for the bank's future. The Pentagon announced new requirements for all financial institutions seeking to serve defense contractors. Banks would now undergo annual civil rights audits, maintain detailed demographic data on their service patterns, and face automatic suspension from government programs if discriminatory practices were identified. General Hayes used the momentum to implement sweeping changes across the defense procurement system. Project Aegis was just the beginning, she announced during a Pentagon briefing. We're launching the Defense Equity Initiative, designed to protect minority contractors from discriminatory treatment throughout the supply chain. The new program required all Pentagon contractors to report instances of discriminatory treatment by financial institutions, legal firms, or business partners. Companies that failed to address documented bias would face contract suspensions. For the first time, the federal government was using its purchasing power systematically to combat institutional racism. Dr. Sterling's case became a catalyst for broader legislative action. Senator Maria Rodriguez introduced the Equal Access to Banking Act, which would require financial institutions to maintain detailed records of their service patterns and face federal penalties for discriminatory practices. The bill gained bipartisan support as lawmakers recognized the national security implications of excluding qualified contractors based on demographics. When we allow discrimination in banking, we weaken our defense capabilities, Senator Rodriguez explained during floor debate. Dr. Sterling's experience shows how prejudice can compromise critical national security programs. The investigation's scope expanded as more victims came forward. The Justice Department established a special hotline for minority business owners who had experienced discriminatory treatment. Within 2 weeks, They received over 3,000 complaints spanning 47 states and involving dozens of financial institutions. Maria Gonzalez, a Latina entrepreneur from Texas, testified before Congress about being denied a business loan despite excellent credit and substantial collateral. The loan officer told me my business plan was unrealistic for someone like me, she said. When I asked what he meant, he couldn't give a specific answer. James Washington, an African-American veteran who owned a cybersecurity firm, described similar treatment when trying to establish a line of credit for a government contract. They kept asking for additional documentation that white-owned firms never had to provide. It was death by 1,000 cuts. The systematic nature of the discrimination became undeniable as patterns emerged across industries and geographic regions. Banks in affluent areas consistently provided inferior service to minority business owners, regardless of their qualifications or account history. Thomas Chen's resignation from Meridian Trust was announced on a Friday afternoon, buried in a brief press release that mentioned strategic restructuring, but internal documents obtained by federal investigators revealed the true scope of his involvement in creating discriminatory policies. Email chains showed Chen coordinating with other regional bank presidents to develop customer profiling techniques that would maintain neighborhood integrity without explicitly mentioning race. The coded language fooled no one in the Justice Department. Richard Pemberton faced federal criminal charges for civil rights violations, while Officer Brennan was suspended pending a departmental investigation. Both men had become symbols of how individual prejudice reinforced systematic barriers to equality. The financial costs for Meridian Trust mounted daily. Stock prices fell 40% as investors fled the toxic reputation. 3 major pension funds divested their holdings, citing environmental, social, and governance concerns. The bank's credit rating was downgraded as analysts questioned its long-term viability. Most significantly, Meridian Trust lost its bid for the $2.8 billion military payroll contract that had motivated much of their discriminatory behavior. The Pentagon awarded the contract to a community bank consortium that had demonstrated strong records of serving minority-owned businesses. Corporate America watched nervously as the investigation expanded. General Hayes had made clear that the Pentagon would scrutinize all aspects of the defense supply chain for discriminatory practices. Companies that had previously ignored bias in their business relationships suddenly faced federal accountability. Dr. Sterling used her platform to advocate for systematic change rather than simply personal vindication. She established the Equity in Defense Initiative, a non-profit organization that would monitor contractor treatment and advocate for policy reforms. My arrest was traumatic, but it exposed problems that have existed for decades, she said during a speech at the National Press Club. We can't let this moment pass. Without creating lasting change that protects all minority business owners, the initiative quickly gained support from major defense contractors who recognized that discrimination anywhere in the supply chain weakened the entire system. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Boeing pledged funding and policy changes to ensure their financial partners met equity standards. General Hayes reflected on the transformation during a staff meeting 6 months after Dr. Sterling's arrest. One incident of injustice has created accountability mechanisms that will protect thousands of minority contractors for years to come, she told her team. This is how systematic change happens, when individual courage meets institutional power. The investigation had revealed something uncomfortable but undeniable. Discrimination in financial services wasn't a collection of isolated incidents, but a coordinated system designed to maintain economic inequality. The federal response had to be equally systematic to be effective. As investigators compiled their final report, the scope of necessary reforms became clear. banking regulations, government contracting policies, civil rights enforcement, and corporate accountability, measures all needed fundamental changes to prevent future discrimination. Dr. Sterling's arrest had started as one woman's encounter with prejudice, but it had evolved into a comprehensive examination of how institutional bias operated throughout American business. The systematic revelation was complete. Discrimination was not aberrant behavior by a few bad actors, but embedded practices that required systematic solutions to address. 2 years after Dr. Amara Sterling's arrest at Meridian Trust Bank, she stood before a packed auditorium at the Pentagon, addressing the first annual Defense Equity Summit. The woman who had once been handcuffed for depositing a legitimate government payment now served as the keynote speaker for an event that brought together minority contractors, Pentagon officials, and financial industry leaders committed to lasting change. When I walked into that bank 2 years ago, I thought I was simply making a routine deposit, Dr. Sterling began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had transformed personal injustice into institutional reform. I had no idea that moment would expose a web of systematic discrimination that had operated in shadows for decades. The audience included representatives from 200 minority-owned defense contractors who had benefited from the reforms her case had triggered. Project Aegis had been completed 6 months ahead of schedule, with Sterling Defense Solutions earning recognition as the Pentagon's Contractor of the Year for innovation and excellence. General Patricia Hayes, now Deputy Secretary of Defense, watched with satisfaction as Dr. Sterling outlined the concrete changes that had emerged from her experience. The Defense Equity Initiative had become a model for other federal agencies, creating accountability mechanisms that protected minority contractors across the entire government. Today, every major bank serving defense contractors must undergo annual civil rights audits, Dr. Sterling continued. Financial institutions that discriminate face automatic suspension from government programs. The result? A 340% increase in minority-owned businesses successfully accessing capital for government contracts. The statistics represented real lives and opportunities. Maria Santos, whose construction company had been repeatedly denied loans before the reforms, now employed 150 people on infrastructure projects for military bases. James, Chen's cybersecurity firm, had grown from a one-person operation to a major Pentagon supplier after gaining access to fair banking services. The transformation extended far beyond individual success stories. The Equal Access to Banking Act had passed Congress with overwhelming bipartisan support, creating federal standards for financial services that prevented discrimination based on race, ethnicity, or gender. Banks now face substantial penalties for disparate treatment of minority business owners. Meridian Trust Bank had ceased to exist as an independent institution. After losing its government contracts and facing billions in civil rights penalties, it was acquired by a regional bank consortium committed to equitable practices. Thomas Chen faced federal prison time for his role in orchestrating discriminatory policies, while Richard Pemberton and officer Kyle Brennan had been convicted of civil rights violations. But the real legacy wasn't in the punishment of those who had discriminated. It was in the systematic changes that prevented future discrimination. Dr. Sterling's arrest had exposed vulnerabilities in the defense contracting system that required comprehensive solutions. The Pentagon had implemented new supplier diversity requirements that went beyond simple numerical targets. Defense contractors now faced regular assessments of their entire supply chain, including relationships with banks, law firms, and subcontractors. Companies that failed to address discriminatory treatment faced contract suspensions. The old system allowed discrimination to hide behind individual discretion and unofficial policies, General Hayes explained during a panel discussion. Our new framework creates transparency and accountability at every level of the defense procurement process. Corporate America had taken notice. Major defense contractors established supplier diversity offices with real authority and substantial budgets. Banking executives attended mandatory bias training and implemented data tracking systems to identify potential discrimination before it escalated to civil rights violations. Dr. Sterling's Equity in Defense initiative had grown into a national organization with offices in 12 states. The non-profit provided legal support for minority contractors facing discrimination, conducted bias training for financial institutions, and maintained databases tracking equitable treatment across industries. We've created a feedback loop where discrimination becomes costly and equality becomes profitable. Dr. Sterling explained to audience members during the summit's networking session. Banks compete to demonstrate their commitment to minority contractors because federal contracts depend on it. The human impact of these changes was evident throughout the auditorium. Young entrepreneurs who might have faced the same treatment Dr. Sterling experienced now found banks eager to serve their businesses. Veterans starting companies after military service accessed capital that would have been denied under the old system. Marcus Sterling, Amara's husband, watched proudly as his wife received the Pentagon's highest civilian honor for her contributions to national security and civil rights. Their teenage daughter, inspired by her mother's example, had started a youth advocacy organization focused on educational equity. During her acceptance speech, Dr. Sterling reflected on the journey from that traumatic morning at the bank to this moment of recognition and systemic change. Individual courage means nothing without institutional power willing to act, she said. General Hayes and her team didn't just seek justice for one incident. They used it to address a problem that had persisted for generations. The ceremony concluded with the announcement of new initiatives, expanding equitable practices to healthcare, energy, and technology contracting. Dr. Sterling's case had become a template for using federal purchasing power to combat discrimination across all government sectors. As attendees filed out of the auditorium, conversations focused on future challenges and opportunities. The systematic changes were working, but vigilance remained necessary to prevent backsliding or new forms of discriminatory treatment. Dr. Sterling stood with General Hayes near the Pentagon's main entrance, watching minority contractors network with bank representatives who were competing to demonstrate their commitment to equity. The scene would have been unimaginable 2 years earlier. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't had the resources to fight back? General Hayes asked. Dr. Sterling considered the question seriously. Every day. That's why this can't be about individual exceptions. It has to be about systematic protection for everyone who comes after us. 6 months later, Dr. Sterling received a letter from a young Latina engineer whose defense startup had just received its first major Pentagon contract. The woman wrote about how the reformed banking system had made her success possible, and how she planned to pay it forward by mentoring other minority entrepreneurs. That letter represents the true measure of our success, Dr. Sterling told her staff during their weekly meeting. When discrimination becomes so costly and equality becomes so profitable that fair treatment becomes automatic, that's when we'll know the system has fundamentally changed. The legacy of those handcuffs in a bank lobby had become a comprehensive transformation of how America's largest institutions treated minority business owners. One woman's courage to demand dignity had created accountability mechanisms that would protect thousands of others for generations to come. What started as a routine banking transaction had become a masterclass in how individual injustice, when met with strategic institutional power, could catalyze systematic change that extended far beyond any single victim or incident. The fight for equality wasn't over, but the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. Discrimination was no longer a cost-free exercise of prejudice. It had become an expensive violation with swift and certain consequences. And for Dr. Amara Sterling, that transformation represented the best possible outcome, turning personal trauma into lasting protection for an entire community of dreamers, innovators, and entrepreneurs who deserved equal access to the American promise. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.